Welcome to Writer's Den. I'm Brenda Joyce Patterson. Writer's Den is a program that showcases and uncovers all things literary in Polk County and beyond. And today we have, to continue the conversation that we had before, Fred Koehler and Sarah McGuire. Thank you so much for coming back, staying with us, for talking with us.
Yeah, well, we switched chairs, so coming back. Totally.
Coming back.
Mhm.
Yes. And I love my outfit so much, I kept it on. Yes. Thank you all for agreeing to continue this conversation. What I'd like to talk about this time, this program, is the kid lit industry and publishing industry. I'm a librarian, and I get a lot of people to come into the library and they're like, I wrote a children's book. What do I do now? But I don't really know very much about the kid lit industry. So why don't you tell us what your top questions are that you all get about the kid lit industry, publishing, and what have you, and we'll go from there.
I'd say probably the biggest one that I get is, it'll be either from a person or that specific person, or I'll have my father, brother, cousin, aunt, friend's friend has written a kid's book story. What do we do now? Typically that's what I get. So I've got this story. How do I get it published? How do I get it, to the New York Times bestseller list, which I think really is what all of us, I mean,
Yes.
I've been in the industry for a little bit. I've got 2 books published, and there's still this part of you every time that's like, this is the one, which is a wonderful part of being in the industry, even though I have yet to, hit New York Times bestseller list. But yeah, I would say that's pretty much, I've got this story, what do I do now? Or I've got this idea, what do I do now?
Yeah, and usually my typical answer for that is take a really deep breath, take yourself out to dinner, because by the time you've finished a story, especially if it's a novel,
Holy smokes.
You've been like cramming yourself into some little corner for 6-8 months and not talking to your friends, like that's like, you need to pull yourself out, you need to take a deep breath, you need to refresh. And you probably honestly need to let that sit for a month without looking at it. And then you need to look at it again and make sure that you're really ready to answer, what do I do with it?
Right. And I know on my end of writing, because I do poems and essays and what have you, what you think you wrote is not necessarily what you wrote. So the idea of putting it down and letting it sit for a little bit, you're able to come at it with different eyes. Yeah. And then you go and you start reading and you're like, I thought I wrote something else. So that's a good thing to give it some time and congratulate yourself for getting that far.
Yes. Right. And so there are 2 sides to the industry with a little bit of gray area in between, right? When it comes to publishing, you've got what everybody calls traditional publishing, which is there's this, this New York or this LA, publishing house that is going to give you an advance. So they're going to pay you money for your manuscript. They are going to edit it, art direct it, do the cover art, get it into the catalogs, get it into the bookstores, get it into, the Scholastic Book Fair. Like, that's their job. Their job is to distribute your work out to the world. And in exchange for that, you get this little tiny percentage of all the sales. The other side of the industry is what we call self-publishing, which is where you take on all the risk. You hire your own editor, your own graphic designer, your own art director. You pay all those upfront costs to get your book created, and then you're going to distribute it through either like your own platform. So if you go and do public speaking, maybe you're going to sell it when you go do your public speaking, or you're going to set up an Amazon account and have Amazon distribute it for you.
Right.
And you keep a bigger percentage in that scenario, because you've paid all the upfront costs and there's no publisher taking anything out of the middle. The difference, the
Big
difference,
difference.
yeah, the difference that I find, however, is that, that the self-published book on average sells like 300 copies, right? And so if you're trying to think to yourself, can I make a living doing this? You have got to hustle to sell books. And so on the flip side of that industry, the traditional publishing industry, you're selling typically in the thousands, and a decent book is going to do in the 10,000s, and a great book is going to do in the 100,000s, and your Harry Potters are in the millions, and so like the economies of scale are in your favor if you can do a traditional publishing book, go through all the hard work of getting in, and then having a publisher distribute it for you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why lots of times you see people who are traditionally published, then after some point in time, maybe switching over and doing self-publishing, only because it's a thing where they've gotten opportunity to get their name out there. They have sort of avenues already set up at that point, because people know their name, know them. And so even if they're not with a traditional publisher at that point, people recognize that name and they'll still take a chance on them. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is how much work truly does go into making a book successful. Oh. And what you get one thing or the other. So with traditional publishing, I guess you get a better chance of having it be really successful, because the marketing, the this, the that, the whatever is already sort of, the avenues are already set up for that, and you don't have to do it.
And I think for me, we were talking about this earlier, but sort of the journey to publishing, for me, one of the most helpful things with traditional publishing was the 6 to 7 years of no. And this sounds bad at first, but there's this period of time where you know that you want to write, you know that you want a story, you have your vision for the story could be really powerful or good, and you send it out and you get no's from agents. You might go to conferences, you get no's from editors. And then you decide, okay, well, I'm going to start working this through a critique group. And the critique group tells you it's not as good as it could be. So for me, there were 6 years of no's. No, this isn't, no, this doesn't work. No, this character seems flat. No, this story structure is off. And while that can seem disheartening at first, those no's are the worst reason to do self-publishing, because those no's are the thing that make you a better writer, and they force you to be better, to work on your craft, to work on your storytelling. And so I think for me, and I know I do know folks within the self-publishing world who set up their own, they have critique partners, they have editors who will give them those no's, so to speak, who will push them to be better. But for me, the benefit was having this bar to reach, having the repeated, this isn't good enough, this isn't there yet. And it's made me work harder at my writing. And I remember when I first started writing this one story that I loved, that I'd written for my sister and started working on, I would not want anybody to be able to read that now. And I thought it was perfect. And it was from the heart. There were so many amazing elements in it that spoke to me, but it was not at a level where it would speak to readers. And I am grateful for those no's, even though they broke my heart when I received them.
Yes, they do.
And I think that's an important thing to talk about when we're discussing traditional or self-publishing, is those no's should not be the reason that you choose to self-publish. And if you do choose to self-publish, and I know folks who have done a fabulous job, you need to make sure that you have that negative feedback and the best, or that critical feedback built into that system if you want to write stories that will sell.
Yes. And so the sort of tried and true method for getting your work to a publisher, and the publisher is the one, again, who would write you a check and say, here's the money we are paying you for this story.
Mm-hmm.
The tried and true way is through a process called querying. And the querying process involves, having a letter that you have written, your query letter that sort of describes your story, and in a very pitch kind of advertising sort of way. It describes your publishing background, so it talks about you, it talks about your story, and it says, I hope you'll enjoy this. It's going to involve a synopsis of your story, which is a more formal, like kind of point by point plot outline. And then sometimes they want the whole manuscript. Sometimes they want the first 2 chapters. Sometimes, every publisher is different, and you have to go onto their website and see what they actually want you to submit, if they want you to submit at all. And there are some publishing houses that don't want you to submit at all unless you have an agent. So that's a whole, we'll get to agents in a minute, but let's assume that there are publishers, and we know this for a fact, there are publishers out there who are open to unsolicited submissions,
Mm-hmm.
and they are looking for new talent, and you have found either their email address or their website or their mailing address. So you're going to take that synopsis, that query letter, and that manuscript, and you're going to send it off to them. Mm-hmm. And chances are you're going to sit on your hands for 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
Right.
Not hear anything. And sometimes the only thing you hear back, if anything at all, is this little slip that you get that's like a form rejection, that just says, that has some check boxes on it, like didn't quite meet my expectations, or didn't fall in love with the story. And that's
not right for us at this time.
Not right for us at this time. And that's the only feedback you get. And if you were to email them back or mail them back and say, hey, can you tell me more? They'd be like, never hear from this person again. They are now blacklisted because they're bothering me, Sort
of, yeah. It's horrible. It feels so horrible, but that's the industry. You say unsolicited. So basically what solicited, the flip side of that, what solicited is that the publisher contacts you and says, I want your stuff. But that only happens after you're like, I don't know, J.K. Rowling or something.
Well,
right?
The idea is that, so there are publishing houses that don't accept unsolicited manuscripts. And so when you're talking about solicited manuscripts, they're typically talking about manuscripts from an agent. So at this point in time, what they're saying is, and this is where, for me, having an agent is helpful, because it is an agent's job to know the publishing houses, to know the imprints, which would be, the sections within that publishing house, to know the editors. So it's an agent's job to say, I have this client who has written this story, and I can think of 5 people who would like this. And so an agent's job is to get the best story possible to the best person possible. And so it's kind of hopefully the opposite of the slush pile for an editor. So where an editor is just reading this sort of, if you're going through a slush pile, it's this shotgun approach to, maybe you'll like this, maybe you'll like this, maybe you'll like this.
Right.
An agent is saying, we talked about this 2 months ago, and I think you'll really like this. And so in that case, it doesn't mean that the editor has to be like, oh, that's Sarah McGuire, or, oh, that Fred Koehler. I want their work. It can be that, but it's more that you have an agent who has sort of looked over this and said, I think this would be good for you.
Right.
Which is why, yes, agents can be helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
So they so basically the agents vet your manuscript and look at it and what have you. And so they put, in some ways, they put like a rubber stamp, like this is a good one. And so we're going to take this and approach the publishers with it.
And we both have agents who have looked at projects that we've worked on and said, nope, this isn't right. So even the agent acts as a sounding board, and their editorial in some ways in telling you that, I will help you sell all your work, but this one it's not ready yet, or it's not right yet, or whatever. And so, how do you get an agent? The same querying process. So every literary agency has their website with how to query them. So you get an agent the same way you get an editor. The agent will help you get an editor, but you still got to go through these processes to get your agent. Now, the coolest and best and thing that we talk about all the time, way to, it's not to get around that process, but to help you in that process, are these conferences.
Yes.
And when you go to a conference, you have the opportunity to have a critique with an editor where you might have submitted 10 pages. And so it's an editor from a publishing house who, if they fell in love with it, they're going to say, Fred, your work is now solicited. I am asking you to send me the whole manuscript.
Right.
And so now you've met them face to face. They've told you they like your work and they want to see the whole thing. And that is like the biggest joy that you can ever have coming home from a conference, is having had that 10 or 15 minutes sitting across from an industry professional who's like, you got something, kid.
Oh.
And underneath that, that doesn't happen. I mean, that's happened. It doesn't happen as often, but underneath that is an industry professional looking at your work and saying, okay, this is working. These 4 things aren't working, but do more of this, this, and this. And it will be at a place where somebody would say yes. So is it as fun to get that sort of feedback? No. Is it helpful? Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. And all of that, I think that's why I like, if we're talking about children's literature, like the SCBWI conferences so much. That's the Society of Children Book Writers and Illustrators. It's so helpful because you have the contact with the industry professionals, with the business side of it, as well as the emphasis on craft. So workshops that help you get to the point where you can write the sorts of stories or craft your story in a way that somebody will say yes. And that's, I think, a big difference. I'm going to say this one other thing. We don't think about this, but as a creative writing teacher, all of our writing in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, we assume that somebody's going to read our work. Like if a professor tells you we're going to have an essay on this book, as long as you turn it in at the right time, you fully expect that your professor will read that and give you a grade.
Right.
The huge switch when you start writing for publication is nobody owes you a read. Not agents, not an editor, certainly not readers. And that's a huge sort of mental switch to go, it is my job to keep somebody reading. And so much of the craft and the work goes from that mental switch of I've written something, you owe me a read. And it's so basic that we don't even think that way, to I've written something and I'm going to write it so compellingly that you have to keep reading. Right. And that for Fred, that's explosions. For me, I don't have as many explosions. So compelling in romance or compelling in middle grade or compelling in a picture book is going to be different.
Right.
But it is definitely that switch of nobody owes you a read. Nobody owes you a read. And so you are going to write something that makes them want to keep reading. And I think that's the biggest switch, and how to do that.
I am so glad that you said that. And that is, in some ways, the single most important thing that we've said up until this point. So could you say it one more time?
Nobody owes you a read. Nobody owes you that. And it's something you earn. And I write fairy tale retellings. My goal is that somebody who likes that type of story will keep reading. I don't expect somebody who likes sci-fi will continue reading. So I'm not saying that every single person who picks up your story needs to like it, but it is definitely a mental switch of nobody owes you anything in this.
And the whole concept of craft, like the whole idea of growing in craft, is really that. It's all about, how do I get that person so hooked that they turn the page? And then once they turn that page, I got to hook them again on the next page so they want to turn that page. So all of the plotting and the pacing and the tension and the micro tension, like everything that you put into that story is all about making that reader want to turn page after page after page. And when it's midnight and they realize they still got to get up in 5 hours and go to work, they're like, they're still going to keep reading. And that is craft. Like the people who are brilliant at craft have figured out how to make you not put down that book.
Right. And I can attest, that I have been there many times reading that book. It's so fantastic. And I'm looking at my watch and I'm looking at the book and I'm like, I could take a nap on my lunch hour. And you keep reading.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Which means, like you say, they have their craft
Mhm.
all polished up, nice and shiny. All of the gears work, all nice and oiled. Yes. And really, as a writer, if you're really wanting to be a writer, your first thing is you're wanting to put out a quality product. And then your second thing is, please, as many eyes as possible, read my writing. But yeah.
And that's one of the most helpful things that that editor or that agent at these conferences or your critique partners are going to say is, this is where I stopped caring. This is where I was confused and would have put it down, because those are the places where somebody would put the book down. And so while it can be, you know, while you have that moment internally where you're like, I cannot believe you are telling me this, when you have a chance to process it,
Right.
it gives you a chance to create a story. And for me, most of the time, it's figuring out what I need to do so that a reader experiences what I already think and feel and see in my head. Because typically, if you have a vision for it, it's not necessarily that the vision of the story is flawed, but your communication of that may be. And so that's where those secondary readers are crazy helpful to kind of be like, I know this may be what you're thinking, but this is what I'm reading, and how can you make those two match?
Right. Jump ship just a little bit to say, so we've talked about the publishing entity as a whole. Now, kidlit stuff, especially picture books. Fred, we're looking at you. I'm aiming at you. So the idea of you have your writing, you approach, and I know we mentioned it sort of before, but say it again. If you're writing a picture book, that's something separate from illustrating a picture book. And so they're two slightly different paths.
Absolutely. Yes. And so you can be an illustrator, you can be a writer of picture books, or you can be a writer illustrator of picture books where you're doing both. And I have been the illustrator and I have been the writer illustrator. I have never been just the writer of a picture book. So everything that I have written, I've also illustrated, but then sometimes I have illustrated on behalf of a publisher. So the way it works is the publisher purchases the manuscript. So they purchase the words first. And so if that writer has written something that that the editor sees it, fell in love with it, has a vision for it, can convince the publisher this is going to make a great book, then the publisher purchases the manuscript from that writer, and then the publisher goes out and picks the illustrator. Now, there may be this moment where they're like, what illustrator would you see illustrating this? They may ask you that, but they also may not.
Okay.
If you're the writer. So basically, when you let go and you sign that contract, you are telling the publisher, you own the rights to make decisions about my project. And that can be like really stressful for some people.
Right.
But for me as an illustrator, so the books that I have illustrated, that the books that I've worked on that have sold more than anything else are the ones where I was just the illustrator and not the writer. And that's because of that whole third thing that we talked about in the previous session, right? So you've got the words going this way, you've got the pictures coming this way, and where they meet, it just creates this sort of fascinating thing. Me as the artist, I finish the story or interpret the story through my eyes, and it becomes like it's a marriage of the words and the pictures. So the words couldn't have done it on their own, the pictures couldn't have done it on their own, but when they meet together, it just makes something so fun and unique that is unique to picture books.
So let's see, what have we missed anything? I feel like I've missed something in this.
So
you think of anything?
I like to talk about the difference between being your sort of introverted professional creative and being your author self. And those are two different hats that you have to wear. What we're doing right now is we're being authors, right?
Yes.
She put on makeup, I shaved, like this is as animated and outgoing as we get, right?
Yeah.
So you can't always just be that huddled in a corner person. You've got to flex, you've got to learn to flex those muscles that are outgoing and and can speak in front of an audience, and especially can speak to kids, right? That's so huge in our industry anyways.
Well, I think specifically of a time where, this is when I lived in Virginia, but this boy that I babysat loved the Origami Yoda series.
Okay.
And Tom Engelberger was going to be speaking in Roanoke. So I drove this boy 2 hours from where I lived in Virginia to go, because it was a huge opportunity. So Luke had read the entire series. And for the 2 hours that we drove there, he recounted the entire series to me, like through all of the books. So we get to this wonderful kids museum in Roanoke, Virginia. We get there early enough that we're fairly far forward in line. And Luke, who has been talking the entire time, when it's his chance to see Tom Engelberger, cannot say a word. And I so appreciated the fact that this author knew what to do to pull Luke out of himself, because if that author had not flexed those muscles of knowing how to pull somebody out of himself, to know how to sort of create this mental and emotional space to have communication, all he would have done was signed these books and then moved on. And so that's a very specific way of where being the difference between like you're huddled in a corner, this is my 5th glass of coffee, a cup of coffee, and I haven't showered in 2 days, I'm on deadline sort of self, versus it does happen, versus being with everybody else. And there's a place for both, but you definitely need to be able to flex that so that people can interact with you either on social media or in person, because that's important. That's another aspect of the hospitality of writing, of creating. So,
and in our industry, it does all boil down to the kids, right? When we write, we are hoping that the words we put on paper, the pictures we put on paper, are inspiring, empathy and courage and commitment and celebrating family and diversity and all of that stuff. Like, we can put that into a story in such a way that it creates these emotional reactions within these kids. We've got to live that out in our daily lives as well. Because if we can't be that kind of light in this world, then we're telling lies on paper. And so we have to live it.
Amen.
I'm gonna give you a hand clap. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Man, I think that we did it then. You all ended this session on the best note possible. Thank you so much for being your extroverted version of yourself and coming and talking here with me and with the audience. And thank you for bringing that light to the world, to kids, to girl power. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. And I know that the readers appreciate that. So I think this is it. Thank you, viewers, for watching us. Thank you for continuing to return to Writer's Den.